The flames licked hungrily at the weathered wooden walls of the two-story farmhouse, casting dancing shadows across the barren Montana landscape. Samuel Henderson stood 30 feet away, his weathered hands gripping a rusty gasoline can, watching. His life's work burned to the ground. The year was 1902, and the harsh winter had claimed everything he'd ever cared about his cattle, his hope, and 3 months ago, his will to continue living. The fire roared against the evening sky, sending sparks spiraling into the bitter February air. Samuel had planned this moment for weeks, methodically removing anything of value, anything that might matter to someone else. All that remained was the empty shell of dreams that had died with the blizzards of December. But as the flames reached the second floor, something impossible happened. 4 small figures emerged from the smoke-filled doorway, coughing and stumbling into the snow-covered yard. Children. 4 girls, their faces streaked with soot, their clothes torn and dirty, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the man who had just tried to burn down their secret refuge. Samuel Henderson's world had just become infinitely more complicated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Henderson had never been a man given to sentiment or self-pity, but as he stood in the charred ruins of his barn 3 months earlier, he'd felt something inside him crack like ice under pressure. The December blizzard of 1901 had been the worst in Montana Territory's recorded history, and it had swept across his ranch like the wrath of God himself, leaving nothing but death and devastation in its wake. He'd found the first of his cattle frozen, solid against the north fence line, their bodies twisted into impossible positions by the wind and cold. Then another. Then dozens more, until the landscape looked like a battlefield where winter had claimed victory over everything that dared to live. The Henderson Ranch had been his father's dream, carved out of the wilderness in 1878 when Montana was still a territory filled with more hope than sense. Old Thomas Henderson had brought his family west from Ohio, carrying nothing but determination and a belief that a man could build something lasting with his own 2 hands. He'd been right mostly. The ranch had thrived for nearly 2 decades, growing from a modest homestead into one of the most successful cattle operations in the valley. But Thomas Henderson had died 5 years ago, leaving the ranch to his only son, a man who'd inherited his father's stubborn streak but none of his optimism. Samuel had run the operation with grim efficiency, expanding the herds, improving the buildings, and slowly building a reputation as a fair but solitary man who kept to himself and expected others to do the same. The isolation had never bothered him. If anything, he preferred it. After watching his father work himself to death, trying to be neighborly, trying to help every struggling homesteader who came through the valley, Samuel had decided that keeping people at arm's length was the safer path. He'd hired when he needed help, paid fair wages, and sent his workers home to their own families when the day was done. He'd never married, never seen the point. The ranch was his wife, his children, his purpose. Every morning he'd wake before dawn to check on the cattle, mend fences, and plan improvements. Every evening he'd sit on his porch with a cup of coffee and feel the satisfaction of a day's work. Well done. It wasn't a life that would inspire songs or stories, but it was his life, and he'd been content with it. Then came the winter of 1901, and contentment became a luxury he could no longer afford. The first blizzard hit in early December, catching everyone off guard with its ferocity. Samuel had prepared as well as any rancher could, moving the cattle to the sheltered valleys, stocking up on feed, and battening down for what he expected to be a typical Montana winter. But there was nothing typical about what followed. The snow fell for 6 days straight, driven by winds that howled like banshees and temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. When it finally stopped, the drifts were 20 feet high in some places, completely burying sections of fencing and making it impossible to reach the cattle in the lower pastures. Samuel had fought his way through the snowdrifts, using makeshift snowshoes and following fence lines that were barely visible above the white expanse. What he found when he finally reached his herds would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cattle had clustered together for warmth, but it hadn't been enough. The cold had been so intense, so relentless, that even the strongest animals had succumbed. Some had frozen standing up, their eyes still open, their breath crystallized in the air around their muzzles. Others had collapsed in heaps, their bodies creating small mountains of death that the blowing snow had already begun to bury. He'd counted the losses methodically, the way his father had taught him to approach every ranch task. Out of 300 head of prime cattle, only 47 had survived. The rest lay scattered across the valley like broken promises, their value measured not just in dollars but in dreams of expansion, of security, of a future that now seemed as frozen as their carcasses. But the cattle were just the beginning. The blizzard had damaged the main barn, caving in a section of the roof and destroying most of his stored feed. The bunkhouse where his seasonal workers lived had lost its chimney, making it uninhabitable. Worst of all, the storm had knocked down nearly 2 miles of fencing, leaving his property boundaries unclear and his remaining cattle vulnerable to wandering onto neighboring land. Samuel had spent the next week in a daze, moving through the motions of ranch life while calculating losses that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The dead cattle alone represented 15 years of careful breeding and investment. The destroyed buildings would cost more to repair than he had in the bank. The fencing would require materials he couldn't afford and labor he couldn't hire. But it was the silence that finally broke him. For 24 years, the Henderson ranch had been filled with the sounds of live cattle lowing in the pastures, horses nickering in the corrals, the distant shouts of ranch hands going about their work. Now there was only the wind whistling through broken boards and the occasional creak of damaged buildings settling under the weight of snow. Samuel tried to maintain his routines, rising before dawn to check on the surviving cattle. But the rituals that had once given his life structure now felt hollow and pointless. He'd walk to the barn and find himself staring at the empty stalls, remembering the horses that had once filled them. He'd check the remaining fencing and think about the herds that should have been grazing beyond it. The neighbors had come by. Of course, the Hendersons from the adjacent ranch had offered to help with the cleanup. The Millers had suggested he might want to combine his surviving cattle with theirs until he could rebuild. Even old Pete Kowalski, who ran the general store in town, had made the 20-mile trip to see how Samuel was managing. Their kindness had been genuine, but it had also been unbearable. Every offer of help was a reminder of his failure. Every sympathetic word, a confirmation that the Henderson ranch was no longer a thriving operation, but a disaster requiring charity. Samuel had thanked them all politely and sent them away, insisting he could handle the situation himself. He'd spent January trying to prove that claim, working from dawn to dusk in an effort to salvage something from the wreckage. He'd repaired what he could, sold what was salvageable, and tried to calculate whether it might be possible to rebuild with what remained. The numbers were brutal. Even if he sold every surviving animal, every piece of equipment, every acre of land, he'd barely have enough to pay off the debts he'd accumulated trying to maintain the ranch through the disaster. Starting over would require capital he didn't have, credit he couldn't get, and a level of optimism that had frozen to death along with his cattle. By February, Samuel had made his decision. The Henderson ranch was finished, and so was he. He'd spent the first week of February settling his affairs with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire adult life. He'd paid off his remaining debts, sold his surviving cattle to the Hendersons at below-market prices, and arranged for his few valuable possessions to be distributed to people who might actually use them. The process had been strangely liberating. Each item he gave away, each obligation he settled, felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders. He'd kept only the basics: enough food for a few weeks, a bottle of whiskey his father had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and the gasoline he'd need for his final task. The plan was simple. He'd burn the house and barn to the ground, erasing the last evidence of the Harrison family's failed dreams. Then he'd take his father's old rifle and walk into the mountains, where the cold would finish what the blizzard had started. It would be quick, efficient, and final. He'd chosen February 15th for practical reasons. The weather was clear, the snow had stopped, and the surviving neighbors were far enough away that they wouldn't notice the smoke until it was too late to interfere. He'd started with the barn, watching 24 years of memories go up in flames without feeling much of anything at all. The house had been harder. He'd walked through each room one final time, remembering his father's voice echoing through the halls, seeing his mother's careful touches in the curtains she'd sewn and the furniture she'd arranged. But those memories belonged to a different time, a different man who still believed that hard work and honest intentions were enough to guarantee success. Samuel had poured gasoline on the wooden floors, the furniture, the walls that had sheltered 3 generations of Harrison men. He'd lit the match and stepped outside, watching the flames take hold with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd finally found a problem he could solve completely. That's when the children had appeared. 4 girls, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12, stumbling out of the smoke-filled doorway like ghosts materializing from his guilty conscience. They stood in the snow-covered yard, coughing and crying, their faces streaked with soot, and their clothes torn from whatever desperate flight had brought them to his burning house. The oldest girl, a thin blonde child with fierce green eyes, stepped forward despite her obvious terror. "Mister," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke, "we're sorry. We didn't mean to cause trouble. We just needed somewhere to stay." Samuel stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These children had been living in his house while he'd been planning his final exit from the world. 4 little girls had been hiding in his home, probably terrified he'd discover them, probably surviving on scraps and whatever shelter they could find. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since the big storm," the girl replied. "Our wagon got stuck in the snow, our ma and pa ... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. These weren't just homeless children. They were orphans, survivors of the same blizzard that had destroyed his ranch. The fire roared behind them, beyond saving now, consuming the last physical remnants of his family's legacy. But standing in the snow, looking at 4 small faces filled with fear and desperate hope, Samuel Harrison realized that his story wasn't quite finished after all. The gasoline can slip from his numb fingers, falling into the snow with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across the valley. For the first time in months, Samuel's carefully laid plans had encountered something he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fire continued to rage behind them, casting an orange glow across the snow-covered yard as Samuel Harrison found himself face to face with 4 children who had just emerged from what should have been an empty house. The oldest girl, despite her obvious exhaustion and fear, maintained a protective stance in front of her 3 younger companions, her green eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "Don't be mad at us, mister," she said, her voice stronger now despite the smoke damage. "We tried real hard not to touch nothing important. We only took what we needed to not freeze." Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand the situation. These children had been living in his house for months, surviving somehow while he'd been wallowing in his own misery, completely unaware of their presence. The implications were staggering and deeply unsettling. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke and shock. The blonde girl straightened her shoulders with a dignity that seemed far too mature for her young age. "I'm Lucy Davidson, and these are my sisters." She gestured to each child in turn. "That's Emma, she's 10. Mary's 8, and little Sarah just turned 6 last month." Samuel studied each face, noting the family resemblances despite their different coloring. Lucy was clearly the leader. Tall for what he guessed was 12 years old, with blonde hair that had once been neatly braided, but now hung in tangles around her thin face. Emma had darker hair and serious brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with careful calculation. Mary was a smaller version of Lucy, with the same green eyes and stubborn chin, while little Sarah clung to Lucy's dress with one hand and sucked the thumb of the other. "Davidson," Samuel repeated, searching his memory for the name. "Were your folks the ones with the wagon train that got caught in the December storm?" Lucy nodded solemnly. "Peo said we were going to make it to Great Falls before the snows got bad. He said we had plenty of time." Her voice cracked slightly. "But the storm came early, and our wagon got stuck in a drift about 2 miles from here. Peo and Mayo ... They went to look for help. They said they'd be back before morning." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Samuel remembered hearing about the wagon train disaster from Pete Kowalski when he'd made his supply run in January. A group of late-season emigrants had been caught in the blizzard while trying to reach the railroad town of Great Falls. Several bodies had been found when the snow finally melted enough for search parties to get through, but there had been talk of missing children that searchers had never located. "That was 3 months ago," Samuel said gently. "We know," Lucy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We waited at the wagon for 3 days, but they never came back. And it was so cold, and Sarah was getting sick, and we didn't have much food left." She looked up at the burning house, then back at Samuel. "We saw your house from the hill, and there weren't no lights on, so we thought maybe nobody lived here. We were just going to stay until the weather got better." Emma stepped forward, her brown eyes reflecting the firelight. "We tried to be real careful, mister. We only stayed in the upstairs room at the back, and we never touched nothing in the other rooms. We made sure to clean up after ourselves. And we only took little bits of food from the pantry so you wouldn't notice." Samuel's throat tightened as he realized what these children had endured. They'd been living like mice in his walls, surviving on scraps and whatever warmth they could find, terrified of discovery but too desperate to leave. While he'd been planning his dramatic exit from the world, 4 little girls had been fighting for their lives just yards away from him. "The food in the pantry," he said slowly. "I thought animals had been getting into it." Mary nodded eagerly. "We was real careful to make it look like rats or something. Lucy said if you thought it was people, you'd go looking for us." The oldest girl shot her sister a warning look. "Mary, hush." But Samuel was beginning to understand the extent of their desperate cleverness. The missing blankets from the storage room. The firewood that disappeared from the shed. "That was you too." "We only took what we needed," Lucy said defensively. "And we never made fires during the day when you might see the smoke. We waited until after dark, and we always put them out before morning." The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and remarkable. These 4 children, the youngest barely 6 years old, had survived 3 months of Montana winter through ingenuity, caution, and sheer determination. They'd lived like ghosts in his house, taking only what they needed to survive while avoiding detection by a man who'd been too absorbed in his own problems to notice their presence. "How did you know when I was in the house?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious about their survival methods. Emma spoke up, her voice matter-of-fact. "We learned your routine pretty quick. You always got up before dawn to check on the animals, and you usually didn't come back to the house until after dark. We knew which rooms you used and which ones you didn't. The back bedroom upstairs was perfect, 'cause you never went up there. And it had a window we could climb out of if we needed to. And we took turns watching," Mary added. "Lucy made us a schedule, like school. One person was always supposed to be listening for you coming back. Samuel looked at Lucy with new respect. This 12-year-old girl had essentially become the mother of her 3 siblings, creating routines and safety protocols that had kept them alive through one of the worst winters in Montana history. She'd managed their meager resources, maintained discipline among the younger children, and made life-or-death decisions that many adults would have struggled with. "You did all this without any adults helping you?" he asked, Lucy's chin lifted proudly. "Pa always said us Davidson girls were tougher than boot leather. He said we could handle anything if we stuck together." The fire was beginning to die down behind them, but the heat was still intense enough to make standing in the yard uncomfortable. Samuel realized they needed to move away from the burning building, but where? The barn was already a pile of charred timber, and the bunkhouse had been uninhabitable since the December storm. "We need to get away from this heat," he said, gesturing toward the flames. "The shed by the old well is still intact. We can wait there until the fire burns itself out." As they walked across the snow-covered yard, little Sarah stumbled with exhaustion. Without thinking, Samuel scooped her up, feeling how light she was, how thin despite her thick clothing. She didn't protest, instead settling against his shoulder with the trust that only very young children can show. "She's been coughing a lot," Lucy said quietly, walking beside him. "I think the smoke made it worse, but she's been sick off and on since we got here." Samuel felt the child's forehead against his neck. She was definitely running a fever, and her breathing seemed labored. "How long has she been ill?" "About a week. Maybe more. Emma found some honey in your pantry, and that helped with the coughing, but she's been real tired." They reached the shed, which was really more of a small cabin that Samuel's father had built as a workshop. It had a wood stove, a few chairs, and shelves lined with tools and supplies. More importantly, it was far enough from the burning house to be safe but close enough to provide shelter. Samuel set Sarah down gently in one of the chairs, noting how she immediately curled up into a ball, shivering despite the relative warmth of the shed. Emma began fussing over her younger sister, checking her temperature and adjusting her worn coat with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for months. "Tell me about your parents," Samuel said as he lit the wood stove. "What were they like?" Lucy's expression softened. "Pa was a blacksmith back in Ohio. Ma taught school before she married him. They said Montana was going to be a fresh start, a place where we could have our own land and build something permanent. Pa was real good with his hands," Emma added. "He could fix anything that was broken. And May taught us our letters and numbers. She said education was the most important thing we could have. Ma always said we were going to have a real house with glass windows and a proper stove," Mary contributed. "She was going to plant a garden and maybe get some chickens." Samuel felt a familiar pang of recognition. The Davidson family had come west with the same dreams his own parents had carried, the same hopes for a better life that had driven thousands of families to brave the frontier. But unlike his parents, who'd arrived during a relatively gentle season, the Davidsons had encountered the brutal reality of frontier life at its worst. "They sound like good people," he said quietly. "They were," Lucy replied, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "Pa said that if anything ever happened to them, we should remember that we were Davidson girls, and Davidson girls don't give up. He said we should take care of each other and never let anyone split us up." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Here were 4 children who'd lost everything, who'd survived through circumstances that would have broken most adults, and their primary concern was staying together. They'd endured months of cold, hunger, and uncertainty, but they'd maintained their family unit through sheer determination and mutual loyalty. "What were you planning to do when spring came?" he asked. Lucy exchanged glances with Emma before answering. "We talked about it a lot. Emma thought we should try to get to Great Falls, where Pa was going to find work. Mary wanted to go back to Ohio to our grandparents, but what? But we didn't know how to get anywhere without money or a wagon. And we were scared that if we went to town, they'd split us up, put us in different homes or send us to an orphanage. Lucy's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. Pa always said the most important thing was keeping the family together. Samuel understood their dilemma perfectly. 4 orphan children would indeed be seen as a burden by most communities, and the likelihood of finding someone willing to take all 4 was minimal. They'd probably be separated, sent to different homes or institutions, never to see each other again. "So you were just going to keep living like this?" he asked. "We were gonna try," Lucy said simply. "We figured if we could make it through the winter, we could maybe build something in the woods come spring. Emma's real good at hunting rabbits, and Mary knows about plants you can eat." The simple statement revealed the extent of their desperation and their courage. These children had been prepared to become permanent wilderness survivors, rather than risk being separated from each other. They'd chosen uncertainty and hardship over safety, because safety would have meant the end of their family. Outside, the fire was beginning to die down, but the house was completely destroyed. Samuel realized that his carefully planned dramatic exit from the world had been thoroughly disrupted by 4 small survivors who'd been living in his shadow for months. The gasoline can still lay in the snow where he'd dropped it, but the rifle he'd planned to use for his final act remained hidden in the shed where he'd stored it weeks earlier. "Lucy," he said carefully, "what would you girls like to do now?" The 12-year-old looked at her 3 sisters, then back at Samuel. "We don't want to be any trouble, mister. We know we were trespassing and stealing your food. If you want us to leave, we'll understand." "Leave and go where?" Samuel asked. "It's February in Montana. The snow is still 3 feet deep, and the nearest town is 20 miles away." "We managed before," Lucy said with quiet dignity. "We can manage again." Samuel looked at the 4 faces watching him with mixtures of hope and resignation. Sarah was still shivering despite the warmth from the stove. Emma kept glancing toward the window as if calculating escape routes. Mary was holding Lucy's hand, with the grip of someone afraid of being separated, and Lucy stood with the bearing of someone far too young to carry such heavy responsibilities. The house where they'd all been living was now a pile of smoking rubble. The barn was gone. The ranch that had been his family's legacy was destroyed. But sitting in the small shed, surrounded by 4 children who'd somehow survived the same disaster that had broken him, Samuel Harrison realized that his story wasn't ending the way he'd planned. In fact, it might just be beginning all over again. "Well," he said finally, "I guess we're all homeless now. We'll have to figure out what to do about that." For the first time since emerging from the smoke, Lucy Davidson smiled. Dawn broke gray and cold over the charred remains of the Harrison ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of ash and regret. Samuel had barely slept, spending most of the night feeding wood into the small stove and watching over 4 exhausted children who'd finally succumbed to the safety of genuine shelter. The shed that had once been his father's workshop was now their entire world, cramped but warm, filled with the soft breathing of survivors who'd found each other in the aftermath of separate disasters. Little Sarah's fever had broken sometime during the night, but she remained weak and pale, curled up in the makeshift bed Samuel had created from old horse blankets and his own coat. Emma sat beside her younger sister, keeping careful watch with the vigilance of someone who'd learned that disaster could strike without warning. Mary had claimed the spot nearest the window, her green eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to appear with the sunrise. But it was Lucy who commanded Samuel's attention that morning. The 12-year-old had awakened before dawn and immediately begun organizing their limited supplies, taking inventory of their situation with the methodical precision of a seasoned frontier woman. She'd found a notebook among his father's old tools and was carefully writing down everything they had, everything they needed, and what she clearly saw as their options for survival. "We got enough food for maybe 3 days if we're careful," she reported to Samuel as he stirred the fire. "That's counting the preserves we borrowed from your pantry that didn't burn up. There's some flour and beans, a little bacon, and about half a bag of coffee." Samuel accepted the cup of coffee she offered, surprised by how good it tasted considering it had been brewed in an old tin can over the wood stove. "You've been thinking about this all night, haven't you?" "Someone has to," Lucy replied simply. "Emma's real good with Sarah when she's sick, and Mary's the best at finding things we need, but planning ahead, that's what I do." "And what does your planning tell you about our situation?" Lucy consulted her notebook with the seriousness of a general reviewing battle plans. "Well, the house is gone, so we can't stay here much longer. This shed's nice and warm, but it's too small for all of us permanent-like. We need to get to town, but Sarah's still too sick to travel, and it's 20 miles through snow that's probably still 3 feet deep." Samuel was impressed by her assessment. In the clear light of morning, their situation was indeed precarious. The shed was adequate for a night or two, but it lacked the space and facilities needed for a longer stay. They had minimal food, no transportation, and winter weather that could turn deadly with little warning. What else? He asked, curious to hear her complete analysis. "Money," Lucy said bluntly. "We don't got none, and you probably don't got much either, considering you was burning down your house. People don't usually burn down valuable property unless they're in some kind of trouble." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Samuel had indeed exhausted his resources trying to recover from the blizzard disaster, and his dramatic gesture the previous evening had been partly motivated by the knowledge that he was essentially bankrupt. But hearing the truth stated so matter-of-factly by a 12-year-old girl was somehow both humbling and oddly encouraging. "So what do you think we should do?" he asked. Lucy looked up from her notebook, her green eyes holding a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. "I think we got 2 choices. We can try to make it to Great Falls, where there's people and maybe work for you and schools for us. Or we can try to make it through the rest of winter here and figure out something come spring. And which do you think is better?" "Depends on what you want to do with us," Lucy replied with characteristic directness. "If you're planning to turn us over to the territorial authorities, then Great Falls is probably best. They got an orphanage there, and we'd probably be warm and fed, even if they split us up." The casual way she mentioned being separated from her sisters made Samuel's chest tighten. These children had been through enough trauma without facing the additional horror of being torn away from the only family they had left. "What if I'm not planning to turn you over to anyone?" he asked quietly. Lucy's expression shifted slightly, showing the first real hope he'd seen from her. "Then maybe we could figure out a way to stay together. But that means you'd be taking responsibility for 4 kids you don't even know, and that's asking an awful lot from someone who just lost everything he had." Emma looked up from her vigil beside Sarah's bed. "Lucy, maybe we shouldn't." "No, Emma," Lucy interrupted firmly. "We gotta be honest about what we're asking. Mr. Harrison's been kind to us, but kindness and taking care of 4 orphan girls for the rest of their growing up are 2 different things entirely." Samuel studied the 4 faces watching him with varying degrees of hope and resignation. In the span of 12 hours, he'd gone from planning his own death to contemplating taking responsibility for 4 children he'd never met before. The dramatic reversal should have been overwhelming, but instead, he found himself thinking more clearly than he had in months. "Tell me about your skills," he said finally. "What can each of you do?" Lucy's eyes lit up at the practical question. "I can cook pretty good, and I know how to manage a household. Pa taught me to read and write and do figures, and May showed me how to sew and mend. Emma's our hunter. She's got real good aim with a slingshot, and she knows how to set snares for rabbits and such." Emma nodded shyly. "I can track animals pretty Good too. And I know which plants are safe to eat and which ones ain't. Mary's our scrounger, Lucy continued. She can find things other people overlook, and she's got a talent for making broken things work again. And Sarah ... Well, Sarah's still little, but she's got a good memory and she learns fast. Samuel was beginning to understand how these children had survived 3 months of winter isolation. Each had developed specialized skills that contributed to their collective survival, and Lucy had clearly taken on the role of coordinator and decision-maker. They weren't just 4 helpless orphans. They were a functioning family unit with complementary abilities. What about you, Mr. Harrison? Lucy asked. What can you do? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Well, if we're going to be partners in this survival business, we need to know what you bring to the arrangement. Can you hunt? Can you build things? Do you know how to get along with people in town? Samuel almost smiled at the girl's directness. I can hunt, though I haven't done much of it lately. I know cattle and horses, and I'm good with tools and building. I can read and write, and I've got some money saved up, though not much. How much is not much? Lucy asked with the bluntness of someone who'd learned not to waste time on politeness. Maybe enough to get us through the rest of winter if we're careful. Enough to buy supplies and maybe rent a place in town until spring. Lucy made a note in her book. That's something anyway. What about after spring? What kind of work can you do if you ain't got a ranch anymore? The question forced Samuel to confront the reality of his situation. He'd been a rancher his entire adult life, but ranching required land, cattle, and capital he no longer possessed. He'd need to find a new way to make a living, and it would have to be something that could support not just himself, but 4 growing children. I'm good with my hands, he said slowly. I can do carpentry, blacksmithing, general repair work. There's always need for that kind of skill, especially in growing towns. Can you teach us? Mary asked suddenly. Pa always said learning useful skills was the best way to make sure you could take care of yourself. Samuel looked at the 8-year-old with surprise. You want to learn blacksmithing? I want to learn whatever might help us survive, Mary replied seriously. Lucy's real smart with planning, and Emma's good at finding food, but I want to be able to fix things and make things. Pa said girls could do most anything boys could do if they set their minds to it. Your pa was right, Samuel said, feeling a growing respect for the man who'd raised these remarkable children. And yes, I can teach you. I can teach all of you. Lucy looked up from her notebook with an expression of cautious optimism. So you're thinking about keeping us, all of us, together? Samuel took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would change the course of all their lives. I'm thinking that maybe we can help each other. You need someone to take care of you, and I need a reason to keep going. Maybe we can figure out how to build something new together. The silence that followed was broken by little Sarah, who'd been listening quietly from her bed. Does that mean we can be a family? She asked in a small voice. I don't know what it means yet, Samuel replied honestly. But I know we're going to find out together. Emma stood up from her place beside Sarah's bed and walked over to where Samuel sat. Without saying a word, she hugged him around the shoulders, her thin arms barely reaching around his broad frame. Thank you, she whispered. One by one, the other girls joined the embrace, until Samuel found himself surrounded by 4 children, who'd somehow become his responsibility and his salvation in the span of a single night. The weight of their trust was both terrifying and oddly comforting. So what's our first step? Lucy asked, ever practical. Samuel looked around the small shed that had become their temporary home, then toward the smoldering ruins of his former life. First, we need to figure out how to get to Great Falls. Sarah needs proper medical attention, and we all need better shelter and supplies. The Henderson Ranch, Emma said suddenly. They're only about 5 miles east of here, and they've got a wagon. Ma and Pao stopped there when we first arrived in the valley. Samuel knew the Hendersons well. Tom Henderson and his wife Martha had been his closest neighbors for years, and they'd offered to help after the blizzard disaster. He'd been too proud to accept their assistance then, but pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "The Hendersons are good people," he said slowly. "They might be willing to help us get to town." "What do we tell them?" Lucy asked. "About us, I mean. About how we've been living in your house all this time." It was a valid concern. The truth might raise uncomfortable questions about Samuel's awareness of their situation, and it would certainly require explanations about their current living arrangements. "We tell them the truth," Samuel said finally. "That you're orphans who need help, and that I'm taking responsibility for you. Everything else is nobody's business but ours." Lucy smiled for the second time since he'd met her. "I think that's a good plan, Mr. Harrison." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be a family, you might as well call me Samuel." "Samuel," Lucy repeated, testing the name. "I like that better than Mr. Harrison." Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered remains of the Harrison ranch. The house where 4 generations of his family had lived was now nothing but charred timber and ash. The barn where his father had taught him to work with horses was gone. The dreams of prosperity and permanence that had sustained his family for nearly 3 decades had been reduced to smoke and memory. But in the small shed that had become their refuge, 5 people who'd lost everything were discovering that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. And maybe, just maybe, this new story would be worth telling. The trek to the Henderson ranch began at midday, when the February sun had climbed high enough to soften the snow's crust and make walking slightly less treacherous. Samuel had fashioned a makeshift sled from boards salvaged from his father's workshop, lashing them together with rope and old leather harness. Little Sarah rode bundled in blankets, still weak from her fever, but alert enough to watch the landscape pass by with wide, curious eyes. Lucy walked beside the sled, one hand resting protectively on her youngest sister while the other gripped a walking stick Samuel had carved for her. Emma and Mary flanked them like scouts, their eyes constantly scanning the white expanse for signs of danger or opportunity. The formation spoke of months of survival training, each child knowing their role in protecting the group. "Tell me about the Hendersons," Lucy said as they navigated around a particularly deep drift. "What kind of people are they?" Samuel considered the question carefully. Tom Henderson was a good man, but he was also practical and sometimes suspicious of situations he didn't understand. Martha Henderson was more intuitive, quicker to offer help, but she was also a woman who asked direct questions and expected honest answers. "Tom's been my neighbor for 8 years, Samuel said, adjusting the sled's rope to avoid a hidden rock. "He's fair in his dealings, pays his debts, and keeps his word. Martha's got a good heart, but she's got strong opinions about how things should be done." "Do they have children?" Emma asked, her hunter's instincts making her wary of unknown family dynamics. 3 boys, all grown and moved on to ranches of their own. Martha's always said she missed having young ones around the house. Lucy absorbed this information with the calculating mind of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. "Do you think they'll help us?" "I think they'll help if they can," Samuel replied honestly. "But they're going to have questions about how 4 children ended up in my care, and they're going to want to know what my plans are for taking care of you." The truth was that Samuel himself wasn't entirely sure what his plans were beyond getting them all to safety. The night in the shed had been spent in practical discussions about immediate survival, but the larger questions of how to build a sustainable life for 5 people with minimal resources remained unanswered. "What if they don't believe us?" Mary asked, her 8-year-old mind focusing on the potential for rejection. "What if they think we're lying about Ma and Pa?" Samuel stopped walking and turned to face the 4 girls. "Then we'll figure out something else. But I want you to understand something. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we're going to face it together." The simple declaration seemed to ease some of the tension in the group. They resumed walking, the sled runners cutting smooth tracks through the snow as they followed the fence line that marked the boundary between the two properties. It was Emma who first spotted the smoke rising from the Henderson ranch house chimney. A thin gray line against the pale sky that spoke of warmth and safety. The sight seemed to energize the entire group, their pace quickening despite the challenging terrain. "There," Samuel pointed toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a natural valley. "That's the Henderson place." The ranch was smaller than Samuel's. Had been, but it was clearly well-maintained and prosperous. The house was a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch and multiple outbuildings that spoke of diversified operations. Cattle dotted the snow-covered pastures, and smoke rose from both the main house and what appeared to be a blacksmith shop. "It looks nice," Sarah said from her position on the sled. "Like the houses in the picture books Ma used to show us." As they approached the main yard, two dogs emerged from the barn, barking a warning but not showing aggression. The sound brought Tom Henderson to his front door, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. "Samuel Harrison," he called out, his voice carrying surprise and concern. "What brings you out in this weather, and who ... His voice trailed off as he noticed the four children. "Tom," Samuel replied, stopping the sled near the porch steps. "I need to talk to you and Martha. It's complicated." Martha Henderson appeared, beside her husband, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone accustomed to managing a busy household. Her gaze immediately went to the children, particularly Sarah's pale face. "My goodness," she said, hurrying down the steps. "Are you all right, dear?" She knelt beside the sled, her hand automatically checking Sarah's forehead for fever. "You look like you've been through an ordeal." "We all have," Samuel said quietly. "Martha, Tom, these are the Davidson girls. They're orphans, and they need help." Tom's expression sharpened with interest and concern. "Davidson? Are these the missing children from that wagon train disaster?" "The same," Samuel confirmed. "It's a long story, but they've been surviving on their own since December. I found them yesterday, and we need to get them to proper shelter and medical care." Martha was already in motion, her maternal instincts overriding any need for detailed explanations. Of course. Let's get them inside where it's warm. Tom, help with the little one. Samuel, you look like you haven't slept in days." The Henderson house was everything Samuel's had been before the fire. Warm, comfortable, and filled with the sense of cooking food and wood smoke. Martha immediately began fussing over the children, checking Sarah's temperature, offering hot soup to the older girls, and generally creating an atmosphere of safety and care. "Now then," she said once everyone was settled around the kitchen table with bowls of hearty stew, "I want to hear this story from the beginning." Lucy looked at Samuel, silently asking for permission to speak. He nodded, and she began the tale of their family's journey west, the blizzard that had trapped them, and their parents' disappearance. Her account was factual and unemotional, but the Henderson couple listened with growing expressions of sympathy and concern. 3 months, Martha murmured when Lucy finished. "You survived 3 months on your own?" "We had help," Emma said quietly, glancing at Samuel. "Mr. Harrison Samuel, he's been taking care of us." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Samuel, you never mentioned having houseguests when we talked last month." This was the moment Samuel had been dreading. The truth about his ignorance of the children's presence would raise uncomfortable questions about his awareness as a neighbor and his fitness as a guardian. But Lucy, with her 12-year-old wisdom, stepped into the breach. "We didn't want to be a burden," she said simply. "We were scared that if anyone found out about us, they'd split us up and send us away." So we tried to take care of ourselves until Samuel discovered us yesterday. It wasn't precisely a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Samuel felt a moment of gratitude for the girls' diplomatic skills, even as he recognized the complexity of the situation they were navigating. Martha's expression softened further. "You poor dears. You must have been terrified." "We were scared," Mary admitted, "but we had each other. Pa always said Davidson girls stick together no matter what." Tom leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "Samuel, what's your plan for these children? Taking care of 4 young ones is a considerable responsibility." Samuel met his neighbor's gaze steadily. "I'm planning to take them to Great Falls, get them proper medical attention, and then figure out how to make a life for all of us. I know it won't be easy, but these girls have been through enough upheaval. They deserve stability and the chance to stay together." "And how do you propose to support 4 children?" Tom asked, not unkindly but with the practical concern of a man who understood frontier economics. "I'll find work. I've got skills: carpentry, blacksmithing, general repair." "Work. Great Falls is growing, and there's always need for skilled labor." Martha exchanged a look with her husband, one of those wordless communications that long-married couples develop. "Samuel," she said carefully, "have you considered that there might be legal complications? These children have no official guardianship arrangements, and the territorial authorities might have questions about your custody of them." It was a concern that had been nagging at Samuel since the night before. In the frontier territories, informal family arrangements were common, but they could also be challenged by officials who insisted on proper legal documentation. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said. "Right now my priority is getting them to safety and medical care." Tom nodded slowly. "I can help with that. I've got business in Great Falls next week, and I can take you all in the wagon. It'll be more comfortable than trying to make the trip on foot." The offer was more generous than Samuel had dared hope for. "Tom, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," Tom interrupted. "I'm offering. These children need help, and neighbors help neighbors." Martha stood up and began clearing the soup bowls. "They'll stay here tonight, of course. The girls can share the guest room, and Samuel, you can take the room above the barn. Tomorrow we'll get them properly outfitted for the journey." Lucy looked up from her empty bowl. "Mrs. Henderson, we don't have money to pay you for your kindness." Martha smiled and ruffled the girl's hair. "Child, hospitality isn't about payment. It's about doing what's right." As the evening progressed, the Henderson house filled with the sounds of children's voices for the first time in years. Emma helped Martha with the dishes, eager to contribute to the household work. Mary explored the house with wide-eyed curiosity, examining the furniture and decorations with the appreciation of someone who'd been living in a shed. Sarah, still weak but improving, fell asleep in a real bed for the first time in months. Lucy found herself in the kitchen with Martha, learning about meal planning and household management with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. "You're quite the little mother," Martha observed as Lucy took notes about preserving food and managing supplies. "Someone has to be," Lucy replied matter-of-factly. "Emma's good at finding things, and Mary's clever with her hands, but planning ahead, that's what I do." "And what about just being a 12-year-old girl?" Martha asked gently. "When do you get to play and be carefree?" Lucy looked up from her notes with an expression far too mature for her years. "When my sisters are safe and settled. When I know we're not going to be separated or sent away. Maybe then I can think about being just a girl." The conversation was interrupted by Tom's return from the barn, where he'd been talking with Samuel about the practical details of their journey to Great Falls. His expression was thoughtful as he settled into his chair by the kitchen fire. "Samuel's got a good head on his shoulders," he told his wife. "He's thought through most of the challenges they're going to face. But Martha, there's something else we need to consider." "What's that?" "Word's going to get around about Samuel. Taking custody of 4 orphan girls. There are people who might not understand the situation, who might make assumptions about his motivations. Martha's face darkened. Anyone who knows Samuel Harrison would never question his character. We know that, but not everyone in Great Falls knows Samuel. And there are always people ready to think the worst of unusual situations. Lucy had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Are you saying people might think Samuel's up to something bad? Tom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing such matters with a child. I'm saying that sometimes people are suspicious of arrangements that don't fit their expectations. A single man taking responsibility for 4 young girls. Some folks might find that unusual. Then we'll have to make sure they understand the real situation, Lucy said with determination. We'll make sure they know that Samuel saved us, not the other way around. As the household settled down for the night, Samuel found himself standing on the Hendersons' front porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. The contrast with the previous evening was stark. Instead of planning his death beside a burning house, he was planning a future that included 4 children who'd somehow become his responsibility and his salvation. Tom joined him on the porch, offering a cup of coffee and the comfortable silence of 2 men who'd shared similar struggles. You sure about this, Samuel? Tom asked eventually. Taking on 4 children is going to change everything about your life. Samuel thought about the question, about the path that had led him from despair to unexpected purpose. Tom, yesterday, I was ready to give up on everything. Today I've got 4 good reasons to keep going. I'd say that's a pretty fair trade. And if the authorities in Great Falls give you trouble about the custody situation, then I'll deal with that when it happens. These girls have been through enough loss. I won't let them be separated if I can help it. Tom nodded approvingly. Your father would be proud of you, Samuel. Taking responsibility for those who can't take care of themselves. That's the Harrison way. Inside the house, the sounds of a family settling down for the night provided a counterpoint to their conversation. For the first time in months, Samuel Harrison was looking forward to tomorrow. The wagon that carried them away from the Henderson ranch 3 days later was loaded with more than just passengers and supplies. Martha Henderson had insisted on packing food, blankets, and warm clothing for the children, along with what she called a woman's touch for their new life in Great Falls. But beyond the physical provisions, the wagon carried the weight of 5 people's hopes, fears, and the uncertain future that awaited them in a town where they had no connections and no guaranteed welcome. Samuel drove the team of horses with the steady competence of a man who'd spent his life working with animals. But his mind was occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with navigation. The money he'd managed to salvage from his ranch disaster would cover basic expenses for perhaps 2 months, maybe 3 if they were extremely careful. After that, everything would depend on his ability to find work and establish himself in a community that might not be entirely welcoming to his unusual family situation. Lucy sat beside him on the wagon seat, her notebook balanced on her knees as she continued her meticulous planning. She'd spent the morning at the Henderson ranch calculating distances, costs, and timelines with the precision of an accountant. Her lists had grown to include everything from the price of flour in Great Falls to the names of churches that might offer assistance to families in need. Samuel, she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over their small caravan. What exactly are you planning to tell people when they ask about us? It was a question that had been troubling him since Tom Henderson's warnings about potential social complications. The truth was both simple and complex. He was a man who'd taken responsibility for 4 orphaned children because it was the right thing to do. But he knew that many people would find the arrangement suspicious or inappropriate. I'm planning to tell them the truth, he said carefully. That you're orphans who needed help, and that I'm your guardian now. But what if they ask about legal papers or official appointments? Lucy persisted. Emma heard Mr. Henderson talking to you about territorial authorities and custody arrangements. Samuel glanced at the 12-year-old beside him, once again impressed by her maturity and foresight. "Then I'll tell them we're working on the legal arrangements. In the meantime, you're my responsibility, and I'm going to take care of you." From the back of the wagon, Emma's voice carried forward. "What if they try to separate us? What if they say you can't take care of all four of us?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Samuel had been avoiding this particular concern, but he knew it was a real possibility. Territorial authorities often looked with suspicion on unconventional family arrangements, and they had the power to remove children from situations they deemed inappropriate. "Then we'll fight it," Samuel said firmly. "We'll get proper legal representation, and we'll prove that you're better off together than apart." Mary's voice piped up from her position near the wagon's tailgate. "What if we don't want to be separated? What if we run away?" "Mary Elizabeth Davidson," Lucy said sharply, "you will not talk about running away. We've had enough of surviving on our own." But Samuel understood the 8-year-old's fear. These children had already lost their parents to circumstances beyond their control. The possibility of losing each other to bureaucratic interference was a terror that struck at the very core of their sense of security. "Nobody's going to run away," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made up his mind. "And nobody's going to be separated if I have anything to say about it. We're a family now, and families stick together." The wagon rolled steadily eastward, following the main road that connected the scattered ranches and settlements of the Montana Territory. The landscape was still dominated by snow, but Samuel could see signs of approaching spring in the way. The ice was beginning to break up along the creek beds, and the subtle changes in the quality of the light dot as they traveled. The children began to relax into the rhythm of the journey. Emma divided her attention between watching the countryside for signs of game and entertaining little Sarah with stories and simple games. Mary had discovered a collection of tools in the wagon bed and was methodically examining each one, asking Samuel about their uses and purposes. It was Sarah who first spotted the smoke rising from the chimney of Johnson's trading post, a combination general store, inn, and saloon that served as a vital stopping point for travelers. Between the ranch country and Great Falls, the building was larger than most frontier establishments, with a wide porch and multiple additions that spoke of prosperity and growth. "Are we stopping there?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "We need supplies," Samuel replied, "and the horses need rest. But we'll need to be careful about what we say and how we present ourselves." Lucy nodded understanding. "You want us to let you do the talking? For now, yes. Until we get a sense of how people here react to our situation." As they approached the trading post, Samuel could see several other wagons and horses tied up outside, suggesting that the establishment was busy with other travelers. The prospect of encountering strangers who might ask uncomfortable questions about his traveling companions made him increasingly tense. The trading post's interior was dimly lit and filled with the scents of tobacco, coffee, and the accumulated odors of countless travelers. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Afternoon," the man said as Samuel and the 4 girls entered. "I'm Bob Johnson. What can I do for you folks?" "We need supplies for the road to Great Falls," Samuel replied, producing Lucy's carefully prepared list. "Food, some blankets, and feed for the horses." Johnson's gaze moved from Samuel to the 4 children, his expression neutral but curious. "Long journey with the little ones, family trip?" "Something like that," Samuel said, hoping to avoid detailed explanations. But Johnson was clearly a man who'd made his living by understanding the people who passed through his establishment. "Haven't seen you before. You folks from the ranch?" "Country? The Harrison place," Samuel admitted. "Or what's left of it." Recognition flickered in Johnson's eyes. "Heard about your troubles with the winter. Tough break, losing everything like that." Samuel nodded, accepting the sympathy while hoping the conversation wouldn't go deeper into personal details. But Johnson's attention had shifted to the children, particularly Lucy, who was studying the trading post's inventory with obvious interest. "Smart girl," Johnson observed. "Got a good eye for quality goods. You teaching her about commerce?" "She's got natural instincts for it," Samuel replied, feeling a surge of pride in Lucy's abilities. "All 4 of them yours?" Johnson asked casually. The question was the one Samuel had been dreading. The truth was complicated, and a lie would be both wrong and potentially dangerous if discovered later. He chose his words carefully. "They're my responsibility now. We're traveling to Great Falls to start over." Johnson nodded slowly, but Samuel could see the man's mind working, processing the information and probably forming his own conclusions about the situation. "Well, starting over's nothing to be ashamed of. This country's built on folks who had the courage to try again." The rest of their business was conducted efficiently, with Johnson proving to be fair in his pricing and helpful in his recommendations about the road ahead. But as they prepared to leave, he pulled Samuel aside for a quiet word. "Mr. Harrison, you seem like a decent man, and those children are clearly well cared for. But you should know that Great Falls has gotten particular about unusual family situations. The territorial authorities have been cracking down on arrangements that don't fit their idea of proper households." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What kind of arrangements?" "Men with children who ain't legally theirs, women living with men they ain't married to. Folks who don't fit the mold that the politicians think makes for respectable communities." Johnson's expression was serious. "I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but you might want to be prepared for questions." "What kind of questions?" "About your relationship to those girls, about your intentions, about whether you're the kind of man who should be trusted with the care of young children." Johnson paused. "Like I said, you seem decent enough, but appearances can be deceiving, and some folks are quick to assume the worst." Samuel absorbed this information with growing concern. The warnings from Tom Henderson were proving to be more than just neighborly caution. "What would you suggest?" "Get yourself some legal documentation as soon as possible. Find someone respectable to vouch for your character. And be prepared to answer a lot of personal questions about your living arrangements and your plans for those children." As they resumed their journey, Samuel's mind churned with new worries. The simple act of taking responsibility for 4 orphaned children was apparently going to be viewed with suspicion by people who didn't understand the circumstances. The possibility of having the girls taken away from him was becoming more real with each mile they traveled. Lucy, perceptive as always, noticed his change in mood. "What did Mr. Johnson tell you?" Samuel considered trying to shield her from the concern, but he realized that Lucy was too intelligent and too experienced in survival to be protected from important information. "He warned me that the authorities in Great Falls might ask difficult questions about our family situation." "What kind of questions?" "About why a single man is taking care of 4 young girls. About whether I'm the right person to be your guardian." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, her notebook forgotten in her lap. "Are you worried they might take us away from you?" "I'm worried they might try," Samuel admitted. "But I'm also determined not to let that happen." From the back of the wagon, Emma's voice carried forward. "What if we told them about how you saved us? About how you found us and took care of us when we had nowhere else to go?" "That might help," Samuel said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "But sometimes people hear what they want to hear, not what you actually tell them." The wagon continued rolling toward Great Falls, carrying 5 people toward an uncertain future. The landscape was beginning to change, with more settlements and signs of civilization appearing along the road. In the distance, Samuel could see the smoke of the growing town that would either welcome their unconventional family or tear it apart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered prairie, Samuel found himself thinking about the events that had brought them to this point. A week ago, he'd been a man with nothing left to live for. Now he was a man with 4 compelling reasons to fight for a future he'd never imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and potential heartbreak. But as he listened to the quiet conversations of the 4 girls in the wagon behind him, as he felt the weight of their trust and their need for stability, Samuel Harrison knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the determination of a man who'd found his purpose in the most unexpected place. Great Falls was still a day's journey away, but the real test of their family's strength was just beginning. Great Falls emerged from the Montana landscape like a promise of civilization carved from the wilderness. The town had grown rapidly since the arrival of the railroad, transforming from a frontier outpost into a bustling community of nearly 3,000 souls. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and the sounds of construction, commerce, and human activity filled the air with an energy that was both exciting and intimidating. Samuel guided the wagon down Main Street, acutely aware of the curious stares his unusual family attracted. Great Falls was large enough to offer anonymity, but it was still small enough that newcomers, especially those traveling under unusual circumstances, drew attention. The 4 girls pressed close together in the wagon bed, their eyes wide as they took in sights they'd never imagined: electric streetlights, multi-story buildings, and more people in one place than they'd ever seen in their lives. "Look at all them people," Mary whispered, her voice filled with wonder and nervousness. "There's more folks on this one street than in our whole county back in Ohio." Lucy maintained her composure, but Samuel could see her grip tightening on her notebook as she tried to process the overwhelming complexity of their new environment. Emma had withdrawn slightly, her hunter's instincts making her wary of the crowd and noise. Little Sarah had moved closer to Samuel, seeking security in his familiar presence. "Where are we gonna stay?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible above the street noise. It was a question that had been weighing on Samuel's mind since they'd left the Henderson ranch. Great Falls had several hotels and boarding houses, but most were either too expensive for his limited budget or unsuitable for a man traveling with 4 young children. He'd been hoping to find family-friendly accommodations, but the reality of the bustling town was proving more challenging than he'd anticipated. "There's a boarding house on Cedar Street that might work," Samuel said, though he wasn't entirely confident about the prospect. "Mrs. Patterson runs it, and she's supposed to be accommodating to families." They found Patterson's boarding house. Without difficulty, a 3-story wooden structure with a hand-painted sign and lace curtains in the windows. The building looked respectable and well-maintained, but Samuel felt his nervousness increase as they approached. This would be their first real test of how the community would receive their unconventional family. Mrs. Beatrice Patterson proved to be a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that suggested she'd been running a boarding house long enough to develop strong opinions about her guests. She emerged from the front door as Samuel helped the girls down from the wagon, her gaze taking in every detail of their appearance and demeanor. "Mr. Harrison?" she asked, consulting a small notebook of her own. "I received your telegram from Johnson's Trading Post. You mentioned needing accommodation for yourself and 4 children." "That's correct," Samuel replied, removing his hat with the courtesy his father had taught him. "We're looking for clean, quiet rooms for an extended stay while I look for work." Mrs. Patterson's attention shifted to the 4 girls who had arranged themselves in their familiar protective formation with Lucy in front. "These are your daughters?" The question was direct and unavoidable. Samuel had spent the last day of their journey preparing for this moment, but he still felt the weight of potential consequences in his answer. "These are the Davidson girls," he said carefully. "They're orphans, and I'm their guardian. We're in the process of making the legal arrangements official." Mrs. Patterson's expression didn't change, but Samuel could see her mind working, processing the information and forming judgments about the situation. I see. And their parents? Died in the December blizzard, Lucy said, stepping forward with the dignity that had impressed Samuel from their first meeting. Mr. Harrison has been taking care of us since then. The boarding house proprietor studied Lucy with the attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. You're very articulate for someone who's been through such trauma, young lady. Our mother was a teacher, Lucy replied simply. She taught us to speak properly and to represent ourselves with dignity. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. Well, that's something in your favor. I run a respectable establishment, and I expect proper behavior from all my guests. No running in the halls, no loud voices after 8 o'clock, and everyone contributes to the household chores. We're used to working, Emma said quietly. We can help with whatever needs doing. I'm sure you can. Now, about the arrangements. Mrs. Patterson paused, her expression becoming more businesslike. I have 2 rooms available on the 2nd floor. One for you, Mr. Harrison, and one for the girls. The rate is $12 per week, including meals. Samuel quickly calculated the cost against his remaining funds. At $12 per week, his money would last perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 7 if they were extremely careful about other expenses. It wasn't much time to find steady work and establish himself in a new community. That's acceptable, he said, though the cost made his stomach tighten with anxiety. There's one more thing, Mrs. Patterson said, her tone becoming more serious. Great Falls has become particular about unusual living situations. The territorial authorities have been known to investigate households that don't conform to conventional standards. I want to be clear that I run a respectable establishment, and I can't have any situation that might reflect poorly on my reputation. Samuel felt the familiar chill of warning. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that a single man traveling with 4 young girls is going to attract attention, whether you want it or not. You'll need to be prepared for questions, and you'll need to be able to provide satisfactory answers. Lucy stepped forward again, her green eyes flashing with determination. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Harrison saved our lives. He's a good man who's trying to do right by us. If people want to think something bad about that, then maybe they're the ones with the problem. The boarding house proprietor looked at the 12-year-old with surprise and what might have been admiration. You're quite the little advocate. Aren't you? I'm the oldest, Lucy said simply. It's my job to protect my sisters and speak up for what's right. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving from Lucy to Samuel and back again. Finally, she nodded. Very well. I'll give you the rooms on a trial basis. But understand that if there's any trouble with the authorities, any questions about the propriety of the arrangements, I'll have to ask you to find other accommodations. Understood, Samuel said, though he felt the precariousness of their situation settling around him like a cold fog. The rooms proved to be clean and adequately furnished, with the girls' room containing 2 beds that could accommodate all 4 sisters. Samuel's room was across the hall, close enough to provide security, but separate enough to maintain propriety. As they settled in, unpacking their few belongings, the reality of their new life began to sink in. It's nice, Sarah said, bouncing experimentally on one of the beds. Softer than anything we've slept on in months. And warm, Mary added, holding her hands near the radiator that heated the room. No more worrying about fires going out in the middle of the night. But Lucy was at the window, looking out at the busy street with an expression of concern. Samuel, what are we gonna do about money? Mrs. Patterson wants $12 a week, and we still need food and clothes and other things. Samuel joined her at the window, watching the flow of people and vehicles on the street below. Tomorrow I'll start looking for work. There's construction happening all over town, and I saw signs for several businesses that might need skilled labor. What kind of work? Emma asked, her practical mind already focusing on the details of their survival. Carpentry, blacksmithing, general repair work. Maybe something in the railroad yards or at one of the mills. I'm not particular about the work as long as it pays decent wages. That evening, as they shared their first meal in the boarding house dining room, Samuel became acutely aware of the attention their family attracted from the other guests. The dining room held perhaps 20 people, mostly traveling businessmen and a few families. But conversation seemed to quiet when they entered, and he could feel curious stares throughout the meal. Mrs. Patterson had assigned them a table near the back of the room, which provided some privacy but also made them feel somewhat isolated from the other guests. The girls maintained their best behavior, using proper manners and speaking quietly. But Samuel could see the strain of being constantly observed. "Mr. Harrison," a voice said from behind him. Samuel turned to see a well-dressed man in his 40s approaching their table. "I'm Daniel Whitmore, president of the Great Falls Merchants Association. I understand you're new to our community." "Samuel Harrison," Samuel replied, half rising from his chair. "These are my the Davidson girls." Whitmore's smile was polite but assessing. "Charming children. Are you planning to settle in Great Falls permanently?" "That depends on weather. I can find steady work," Samuel said carefully. "I'm a skilled carpenter and blacksmith, and I'm hoping to establish myself here." "Excellent. We're always in need of skilled craftsmen. Perhaps you could stop by my office tomorrow. I might be able to point you toward some opportunities." The offer seemed genuine, but Samuel detected an undertone of curiosity that made him wary. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore." "Wonderful. And of course, we'll want to make sure you and your family are properly welcomed into our community. There are certain procedures for new residents, particularly those with children. Registration with the territorial authorities, school enrollment, that sort of thing." Samuel felt his chest tighten. "Of course." After Whitmore left, Lucy leaned close to Samuel. He seemed nice enough, but he was asking a lot of questions. "People are curious about newcomers," Samuel said, though he shared her unease. "We'll just have to be patient and prove ourselves through our actions." As they prepared for bed that night, Samuel stood at his window looking out at the gaslit streets of Great Falls. The town represented opportunity and hope, but it also represented scrutiny and potential danger. He'd brought 4 children to a place where their family arrangement would be questioned, where officials might decide that his guardianship was inappropriate, where a single mistake could result in the girls being taken away from him. From across the hall, he could hear the soft murmur of the girls' voices as they settled into their shared room. Lucy was probably making lists and plans. Emma was likely checking the window for escape routes. Mary was examining the room's furnishings with curiosity. And Sarah was probably just grateful to be warm and safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. As he began the process of finding work and establishing their place in the community. But tonight, for the first time in months, all 5 members of their unlikely family were sleeping under the same roof with full bellies and genuine hope for the future. It was a start, even if it was a precarious one. Samuel's first week in Great Falls passed in a blur of job hunting, bureaucratic requirements, and the constant awareness that his family was being watched and evaluated by people who held their future in their hands. The town that had seemed full of opportunity from a distance proved to be a complex web of social hierarchies, unwritten rules, and suspicious officials who viewed newcomers with varying degrees of skepticism. The meeting with Daniel Whitmore had led to several promising job interviews, but each opportunity came with uncomfortable questions about his personal situation. The foreman at the railroad construction site had been blunt. "Harrison, you've got the skills we need, but we can't have workers who might bring scandal to the company. This business with you and those 4 girls, it's got people talking." "What kind of talking?" Samuel had asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The kind that suggests a man doesn't take responsibility for 4 children without expecting something in return. The kind that wonders why a respectable widower or bachelor wouldn't have found a wife instead of collecting orphan girls. The Implications were clear and deeply offensive. Samuel had left that interview with his jaw clenched and his determination hardened. But the pattern repeated itself at the lumber mill, the blacksmith shop, and every other establishment where he'd inquired about work. Great Falls might need skilled craftsmen, but it apparently preferred ones who came with conventional family arrangements. Meanwhile, the girls were facing their own challenges. Lucy had enrolled them in the local school, where they were immediately marked as curiosities. The other children whispered about the orphan girls, who lived with a man who wasn't their father. Some teachers were kind, but others seemed to view the Davidson sisters as potential sources of disruption to their carefully ordered classrooms. "They keep asking about our situation," Emma reported during one of their evening conversations in the boarding house. "Mrs. Coleman asked me 3 times today if we were properly cared for and if we felt safe in our living arrangements." "What did you tell her?" Samuel asked, though he was increasingly worried about where such questions might lead. "I told her we were safer and happier than we'd ever been," Emma replied firmly. But she kept writing things down in her notebook, like she was making a report. Lucy had been unusually quiet during these discussions, but now she spoke up with the serious tone that indicated she'd been thinking carefully about their situation. "Samuel, I think we need to talk about what's really happening here." "What do you mean?" "I mean that people aren't just curious about us. They're building some kind of case against us. Mrs. Patterson asks questions about our daily routines. Mr. Whitmore keeps stopping by to check on how we're settling in. And now the school teachers are taking notes about our answers." Samuel felt a chill of recognition. Lucy was right. The pattern of questioning was too consistent and too focused to be mere curiosity. Someone was systematically gathering information about their family, probably to present to the territorial authorities as evidence of an inappropriate living situation. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, respecting the 12-year-old's judgment in matters of survival and strategy. "I think we need to find out who's really behind this and what they're planning," Lucy said. "And I think we need to get our own documentation together before they make their move." The next morning, Samuel left the boarding house with a new sense of urgency. Instead of job hunting, he made his way to the territorial courthouse where he hoped to begin the legal process of formalizing his guardianship of the 4 girls. The building was an imposing 2-story structure that housed the offices of judges, clerks, and the various officials who administered territorial law. The clerk at the guardianship office was a thin, nervous man named Preston Morris who seemed uncomfortable with Samuel's request from the moment he explained his situation. "Mr. Harrison," Morris said, shuffling through papers with obvious agitation, "formal guardianship of 4 unrelated children is a complex legal matter. There are questions of suitability, financial capacity, and moral fitness that must be thoroughly investigated." "I understand," Samuel replied patiently. "That's why I'm here. I want to begin the process properly." "Well, that's not entirely up to me, you see. Given the unusual circumstances of your case, I'm required to refer the matter to Judge Cornelius Blackwood for preliminary review." The name sent a jolt of alarm through Samuel. Judge Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a stern moralist who took particular interest in cases involving the welfare of children. He was also rumored to have political ambitions that made him eager to demonstrate his commitment to conventional family values. "When would this preliminary review take place?" Samuel asked. "Judge Blackwood has scheduled a hearing for next Tuesday. You and the children will be required to appear for questioning about your living arrangements and the circumstances that led to your guardianship." Samuel left the courthouse with a growing sense of dread. A formal hearing before Judge Blackwood was exactly the kind of official scrutiny he'd been hoping to avoid. The judge would have the power to remove the girls from his care immediately if he deemed the situation inappropriate. That afternoon, he decided to visit the Great Falls Public Library, hoping to research territorial law and understand exactly what he might be facing. The library was a modest but well-stocked building that served as one of the town's centers of learning and culture. The librarian, Miss Catherine Walsh, was a woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to helping people find information they needed. "Mr. Harrison," she said, recognizing him from his previous visits to the library with the girls. "What can I help you find today?" "I'm looking for information about territorial guardianship laws," Samuel said, deciding that honesty was his best strategy. Specifically, the requirements for a single man to obtain legal custody of orphan children. Miss Walsh's expression grew serious. "That's a complex area of law, and it's been changing recently. The territorial legislature has been under pressure to tighten regulations about child welfare and family arrangements." She led him to a section of legal texts and began pulling relevant volumes from the shelves. "The basic requirements are straightforward proof of financial stability, character references, and a suitable living environment. But there are also subjective criteria about moral fitness and appropriateness that give judges considerable discretion." "What kind of discretion?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The power to determine whether a particular arrangement serves the best interests of the children involved. In cases involving single men and female children, judges often err on the side of caution." Samuel spent the next 2 hours reading through territorial statutes, court decisions, and legal precedents. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. While the law didn't explicitly prohibit single men from serving as guardians, it gave judges broad authority to make decisions based on community standards and moral considerations. More concerning were the recent cases Miss Walsh showed him, 3 instances in the past year where single men had been denied guardianship of unrelated children, even when the children themselves had testified that they wanted to remain with their proposed guardians. "Miss Walsh," Samuel said finally, "in your opinion, what are the chances that Judge Blackwood would approve my guardianship application?" The librarian was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Harrison, I've known Judge Blackwood for several years. He's a fair man in many ways, but he's also very concerned about appearances and community standards. Your situation is unusual, and unusual situations make him uncomfortable. So you think he'll deny the application?" "I think he'll be looking for reasons to protect those children from what he might perceive as an inappropriate situation. Whether that's fair or not, well, that's a different question entirely." Samuel returned to the boarding house that evening with a heavy heart. The legal research had confirmed his worst fears. Judge Blackwood would have both the authority and the apparent inclination to remove the girls from his care. The hearing scheduled for the following Tuesday might well be the end of their family. He found the girls in their room, with Lucy helping Mary with her arithmetic homework, while Emma read to Sarah from a book of fairy tales. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it made the looming crisis even more heartbreaking. "Samuel," Lucy said, looking up from Mary's schoolwork, "you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened?" He told them about the courthouse visit, the scheduled hearing, and the research he'd done at the library. The girls listened with growing alarm as he explained the legal challenges they were facing. "So they might take us away from you?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. "They might try," Samuel said, kneeling beside the youngest girl. "But I'm not going to let that happen without a fight." "What kind of fight?" Emma asked, her hunter's instincts making her think in terms of practical resistance. "A legal fight," Samuel said firmly. "We're going to that hearing prepared with evidence that we're a real family, that you're happy and well cared for, and that separating us would be harmful to all of you." Lucy was taking notes again, her mind already working on strategy. "What kind of evidence?" "Character references from people who know us. Documentation of your school performance and health. Testimony about how you've been cared for and how you feel about our family. What about Mrs. Patterson? Mary asked. She's been asking lots of questions, but she's seen how we live. She knows we're not doing anything wrong. Samuel hesitated. Mrs. Patterson had indeed been asking questions, but he wasn't sure whether her interest was supportive or suspicious. I'll talk to her, he said finally. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that some people might testify against. U.S. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Samuel visited everyone who might be willing to speak on their behalf. The Henderson family made the journey to Great Falls to provide character references. Several of the girls' teachers agreed to testify about their academic progress and behavior. And even Dr. Mitchell, who had examined the girls when they first arrived in town, offered to provide a medical assessment of their health and well-being. But for every potential supporter, there seemed to be someone equally willing to express doubts about their situation. Samuel overheard conversations in the boarding house dining room that made it clear their family arrangement was a source of considerable speculation and disapproval. It's not natural, one guest had said to another. A man doesn't take in 4 young girls without expecting something in return. Mark my words, there's more to this story than meets the eye. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. As the weekend approached, Samuel found himself alternating between hope and despair. They had gathered compelling evidence of their family's stability and happiness, but they were also facing a judge who seemed predisposed to view their situation with suspicion. On Sunday evening, as they sat together in the boarding house parlor, Lucy made an observation that surprised everyone. "You know what's funny?" she said, looking up from her ever-present notebook. "All these people who are worried about us being in danger or being taken advantage of, none of them have actually asked us what we want." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "I mean that judge. Blackwood and all these other people are so busy deciding what's best for us that they haven't bothered to find out what we think about our own lives. They're treating us like we're too young or too stupid to know whether we're happy or not." Emma nodded emphatically. "Lucy's right. Every adult who's talked to us has asked if we're safe or properly cared for, but none of them have asked if we want to stay together or if we love Samuel." "Do you?" Samuel asked quietly. "Love me, I mean?" 4 voices answered simultaneously. "Yes, then that's what we'll tell Judge Blackwood," Samuel said, feeling a surge of determination. "We'll tell him that we're a family because we choose to be, not because the law says we have to be." Tuesday morning was only 2 days away, and everything they'd built together was about to be put to the ultimate test. The territorial courthouse buzzed with unusual activity on Tuesday morning, February 27, 1902, word of the Harrison guardianship. Hearing had spread through Great Falls like wildfire, drawing curious spectators, concerned citizens, and what appeared to be several newspaper reporters. Samuel had hoped for a quiet, private proceeding, but it seemed their unconventional family had become a matter of public interest. Judge Cornelius Blackwood entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man who understood the weight of his decisions. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through anyone who stood before his bench. His reputation for moral strictness preceded him, and Samuel felt his stomach tighten as the judge surveyed the assembled crowd. "This hearing," Judge Blackwood announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "will determine whether Samuel Harrison is suitable to serve as legal guardian to 4 minor children, Lucy, Emma, Mary, and Sarah Davidson. The welfare of these children is paramount, and I will not be swayed by sentiment or unconventional arrangements that may compromise their proper upbringing." Samuel sat at the plaintiff's table with a court-appointed attorney, James McKenna, who had agreed to represent him despite expressing serious doubts about their chances of success. The 4 girls sat in the front row of the gallery, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Lucy held Sarah's hand while Emma and Mary, flanked their younger sisters like protective sentries. The prosecution was led by Territorial Attorney General William Crawford, an ambitious politician who had made child welfare a cornerstone of his public image. Crawford rose to present his opening statement with the confidence of a man who believed he was fighting for righteousness itself. Your Honor, Crawford began, the state has a compelling interest in protecting vulnerable children from situations that may appear charitable on the surface, but actually place them at risk. Mr. Harrison, while perhaps well-intentioned, has created an arrangement that defies conventional wisdom about proper child rearing and exposes these innocent girls to potential harm. Crawford's argument was methodical and damning. He presented testimony from concerned citizens who questioned the propriety of a single man housing 4 young girls. He introduced evidence of community gossip and speculation about Samuel's motives. He even called Mrs. Patterson to testify about the unusual dynamics she had observed in the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson, Crawford asked, in your professional opinion as someone who has managed family accommodations for 15 years, would you consider Mr. Harrison's arrangement with these children to be normal? Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. Well, it's certainly unusual. Most single men don't take responsibility for 4 children who aren't their own. And have you observed any behavior that might be considered inappropriate? No, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Mr. Harrison has been entirely proper in his conduct. The children are well cared for, well behaved, and clearly devoted to him. Crawford's expression showed disappointment at this answer, but he pressed on. Nevertheless, wouldn't you agree that these children would be better served in conventional family arrangements, with married couples who could provide both maternal and paternal guidance? That would depend on the couples in question, Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice growing stronger. I've seen plenty of conventional families that were disasters, and I've seen this unconventional one that seems to work quite well. The prosecution's case continued for nearly 2 hours, with witness after witness expressing concerns about the Harrison family arrangement. But as the morning progressed, Samuel noticed something unexpected happening. Many of the witnesses, when pressed for specific examples of inappropriate behavior or actual harm to the children, could provide none. Their objections were based on principle and appearance rather than evidence. When McKenna rose to present the defense, he began with a simple but powerful strategy. He called the Henderson family to testify about their observations of Samuel and the girls during their stay at the ranch. Tom Henderson took the stand, with the calm authority of a man who had spent his life making practical judgments about character and competence. Your Honor, I've known Samuel Harrison for 8 years. He's a man of integrity who honors his commitments and treats others with respect. When he appeared at my ranch with these 4 children, it was clear that he had taken responsibility for them, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. And how did the children appear to you? McKenna asked. They were obviously devoted to him and to each other. They functioned as a family unit, with each child contributing to the welfare of the group. It was remarkable to see how well they had adapted to difficult circumstances. Martha Henderson's testimony was even more compelling. I've raised 3 boys and helped deliver dozens of babies in our community. I know something about children and family dynamics. What I saw at the Harrison place was a man who had become a father to 4 children who desperately needed one. The love and protection he provided them was genuine and selfless. The defense continued with testimony from Dr. Mitchell, who had examined the girls upon their arrival in Great Falls. The children showed no signs of abuse or neglect. In fact, they were remarkably healthy and well-adjusted considering the trauma they had endured. Mr. Harrison had clearly provided excellent care for them. Several of the girls' teachers testified about their academic performance and behavior in school. Despite the disruption to their education, all 4 girls were performing at or above grade level, and they consistently demonstrated the kind of moral character and social skills that spoke to good parenting. But it was Miss Catherine Walsh, the librarian, who provided perhaps the most significant testimony for the defense. Your Honor, I've observed the Harrison family during their frequent visits to the library. What I see is a man who has encouraged these children to learn, to read, and to educate themselves. He treats them with respect and affection, and they respond with the kind of trust and devotion that can only come from feeling genuinely loved and protected. As the afternoon wore on, Judge Blackwood called for a recess before hearing testimony from the children themselves. During the break, Samuel gathered his family in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. "How do you think it's going?" Lucy asked, her notebook filled with observations about the proceedings. "Better than I expected," McKenna admitted. "The prosecution's case is built on assumptions and social prejudices, but they haven't been able to provide evidence of actual harm or inappropriate behavior." "What happens when we testify?" Emma asked. "You tell the truth," Samuel said simply. "You tell the judge what your life has been like, how you feel about our family, and what you want for your future." When the hearing resumed, Judge Blackwood announced that he would question each child individually. Lucy was called first, and she approached the witness stand with the composure of someone far older than her 12 years. "Miss Davidson," the judge began, "I want you to understand that you can speak freely here. No one will punish you for telling the truth about your situation." "I understand, Your Honor," Lucy replied clearly. "Do you feel safe in Mr. Harrison's care?" "Yes, sir, safer than I've felt since our parents died." "Has Mr. Harrison ever behaved inappropriately toward you or your sisters?" "No, sir. He's been nothing but kind and protective. He's taught us important skills, encouraged our education, and made sure we could stay together as a family." "Judge." Blackwood leaned forward, his expression serious. "Lucy, you're a bright girl. Do you understand that there are people who believe you and your sisters would be better off in conventional families, with married couples who could provide both a mother and a father?" Lucy was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Your Honor, I've been taking care of my sisters for months before we ever met Samuel. I know what it's like to be responsible for people you love. Samuel didn't have to take us in, but he did. He didn't have to fight for us, but he is. A real father couldn't love us more than he does. But wouldn't you like to have a mother figure in your life?" "I'd like for my real mother to still be alive," Lucy said, her voice catching slightly. "But she's not, and no one can replace her. What Samuel has given us is safety, love, and the chance to stay together. That's more than most people have offered us." Emma's testimony was brief but powerful. When asked about her feelings toward Samuel, she said simply, "He saved our lives. Not just from dying in the cold, but from being separated from each other. That's what a real father does." Mary, despite her young age, spoke with surprising eloquence about the skills Samuel had taught her and the security she felt in their family. "He doesn't just take care of us," she said. "He helps us learn to take care of ourselves and each other." But it was little Sarah's testimony that seemed to affect the courtroom most profoundly. When Judge Blackwood asked her about her feelings toward Samuel, she climbed down from the witness chair and walked over to where he sat. "He's my daddy now," she said simply, taking his hand. "Not the same as my first daddy, but just as good. He reads me stories and makes sure I'm not scared when I have bad dreams. Why would you want to take him away from me?" The courtroom was silent as Sarah returned to her seat. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat and announced that he would recess until the following morning to consider his decision. That night, the Harrison family gathered in Samuel's room at the boarding house, unable to sleep as they waited for the judge's verdict. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing memories and hopes for the future, while trying not to dwell on the possibility that this might be their last night together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Samuel said as they prepared to separate, "for the night, I want you to know that you've made my life better in every way possible. You've given me a purpose and a family I never thought I'd have. You saved us first, Lucy said firmly. Everything good that's happened to us happened because you were willing to risk everything for 4 children you'd never met. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than it had been the previous day. Judge Blackwood entered with a folder of papers and an expression that revealed nothing about his intentions. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, he began, I have reached a decision in the matter of Harrison versus the Territory of Montana regarding guardianship of the Davidson children. Samuel felt his heart pounding as he waited for the words that would determine their fate. The law exists to protect children from harm and to ensure they receive proper care and guidance. In conventional circumstances, this would mean placement with married couples who can provide both maternal and paternal influence. However, the law also recognizes that the best interests of the children must be the paramount consideration. Judge Blackwood paused, his gaze moving from Samuel to the 4 girls and back again. The evidence presented shows that Mr. Harrison has provided excellent care for these children under extraordinary circumstances. They are healthy, well-educated, and clearly devoted to him and to each other. More importantly, they have expressed their own desires clearly and consistently. Samuel held his breath. While this arrangement is unconventional, it is not unprecedented, and it appears to serve the best interests of all parties involved. Therefore, I am granting Mr. Harrison's petition for legal guardianship of Lucy, Emma, Mary, and Sarah Davidson, with the provision that the family submit to periodic review by Territorial Social Services to ensure continued appropriate care. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and surprised murmurs. Samuel felt tears streaming down his face as Lucy threw her arms around him, followed immediately by her 3 sisters. We did it, Emma whispered. We're really a family now. We're always a family, Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. Now it's just official. As they left the courthouse together, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a broken man ready to end his life in the flames of his own despair. Now he was the legal guardian of 4 remarkable children who had given him a reason to live and a future to build. The road ahead would still be challenging. They would need to find permanent housing, establish Samuel in steady employment, and navigate the complexities of their unique family structure. But they would face these challenges together, as they had faced everything else with love, determination, and the unshakable bond of a family that had chosen itself. Great Falls stretched out before them, no longer a place of judgment and suspicion, but a community where they had proven that love could take many forms and still be real. The Harrison family had defied convention, challenged authority, and ultimately triumphed through the simple power of refusing to give up on each other. As they walked toward their boarding house, planning their first official day as a legally recognized family, Samuel realized that sometimes the best stories don't end with a dramatic conclusion. They end with the quiet beginning of an ordinary life made extraordinary by the people who choose to share it. The Davidson girls had lost their first family to tragedy, but they had gained a second family through choice, courage, and the kind of love that transcends legal definitions. And Samuel Harrison, who had once been ready to burn his life to the ground, had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the ashes of what came before. Their story was far from over. It was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.